Once upon a time, a little girl named Faith found herself living in a place unlike any other, a place she would never have chosen for herself if she'd had the chance. Faith was a quiet, curious girl with a heart full of questions and a spirit that yearned for freedom. But this place, where other children like her were brought together, was far from a happy home. The tall gray walls around them seemed to stretch forever, and the adults there rarely smiled or showed warmth. They didn't share stories or offer hugs, and they expected each child, no matter how young, to complete difficult tasks each day. Each morning, Faith and the other children would be given their chores, and they would work until the sun dipped low, leaving them tired and wishing for a gentler life. Faith would often dream of a world beyond those walls, a world she could only imagine. She longed for open fields, cozy homes, and people who cared about her, who would look into her eyes with kindness. As the days passed, the spark of hope in her heart flickered brighter, and Faith began to devise a plan. One evening, when the sky turned a soft purple and the shadows crept through the hallways, Faith found her moment. She tiptoed quietly through the dark corridors, her heart pounding, her small feet barely making a sound. She took a deep breath, pushed open a creaky door, and slipped out into the cool night. Freedom tasted like the fresh evening air on her skin, and Faith smiled for the first time in a long while. She hadn't thought beyond this moment, beyond the walls that held her in. So she simply walked. The streets were unfamiliar, and dim street lights cast gentle glows along her path. She held her small arms around herself as a light breeze danced through her hair. But as the excitement of escape began to fade, Faith felt the weight of the world settle onto her small shoulders. She realized she was truly alone, and her tummy rumbled with hunger. She had walked far, but she had no idea where she was or where she should go. Faith found a little park with benches and sat down, her feet aching. Faith settled herself on the park bench, curling up under the dim glow of a street lamp. For a moment, she felt as though the stars were watching over her, like a family from above. She whispered a quiet wish for warmth and safety, and her heart felt just a bit lighter. As she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of the day wash over her, and soon she drifted into a deep, quiet sleep. In her dream, Faith found herself standing in the middle of a sunlit field. The grass swayed around her ankles, tall and green, and wildflowers painted the meadow with splashes of bright color. Birds chirped happily in the trees, and the air smelled of lavender and sunshine. Faith looked around, her heart swelling with joy. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if she'd been brought to a place where she truly belonged. Just then, she saw two people standing in the distance, a man and a woman with warm, gentle faces. They waved to her, and she felt a rush of excitement as she started to run toward them. With each step, Faith felt lighter and lighter, like she was flying through the field. Her laughter bubbled up, free and full of joy. The couple opened their arms, and Faith dashed forward, feeling safe, feeling home. As she got closer, she noticed small, familiar details. The woman's smile was just like hers, and the man had the same brown curls she saw when she looked in a mirror. These were her parents. They knelt down, and Faith practically leaped into their embrace, feeling their warmth and love surrounding her. In their arms, she felt like the happiest girl in the world, her heart filled with a love that was both new and deeply familiar. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something changed. The field around them grew dim, shadows stretched long and dark, and a chill crept through the air. Faith's parents began to pull away, their faces growing distant, their smiles fading, She reached out, trying to hold on to them, but they drifted further and farther back, as if something was pulling them away. "No, don't go!" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty field. She felt a sudden coldness seep through her, a fear that made her heart pound. Her parents looked back at her, their faces blurred by shadows, their figures fading like mist. The sky turned dark and stormy, and a cold wind whipped through the grass, which now seemed brittle and sharp against her skin. The warmth of her parents' arms was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that left her shivering and alone. She called out again, her voice breaking, but the wind only howled louder, swallowing her words. Faith looked around, her heart racing, her eyes searching the darkness. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. In the distance, a pair of cold, empty eyes watched her from the shadows, and the sight made her heart fill with dread. The dream became a nightmare as a figure stepped closer, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Just as the fear began to overwhelm her, Faith jolted awake. Her heart pounded, and for a moment she sat up on the bench, breathing heavily, her eyes darting around the park, half expecting to see shadows lurking nearby. But it was quiet and still. The street lamp flickered gently above her, and the stars twinkled down, serene and watchful. She was alone in the dark, but she could still feel the lingering warmth of her parents' embrace from her dream, a memory that was both beautiful and bittersweet. Faith sat on the park bench, still shaken from her dream, when a soft, pitiful meow broke the quiet night. She looked down and saw a tiny kitten huddled at her feet, its fur wet and matted, its big round eyes staring up at her as if asking for help. Faith's heart melted instantly. "Hello there, little one," she whispered, reaching out her hand slowly so as not to startle the kitten. It took a hesitant step forward, then another, before brushing its tiny head against her fingers. She scratched behind its ears gently, and the kitten purred, its whole little body vibrating with the sound. Faith smiled for the first time that night. "Simba," she murmured, naming him after the brave lions she remembered from a story someone once told her. "That's what I'll call you." The two of them were like a perfect pair, both small and lost, each needing the other's warmth and companionship. From that night on, Simba and Faith became inseparable. Every morning, Faith and Simba would wander the streets together, searching for scraps to fill their bellies. They learned to peek around the back doors of cafes and diners, hoping to catch the kindness of strangers. Simba, with his wide, pleading eyes and tiny, heart-melting meows, proved to be a surprisingly good partner in their quest. More often than not, someone would toss them a piece of bread or a small scrap of meat. They'd split it between them, Faith making sure Simba got his share first, and, together, they'd feel like they'd conquered the day. During the afternoons, Faith would find herself daydreaming while they wandered. She'd imagine a warm home with walls painted in soft, happy colors, where she and Simba could curl up by a fireplace and never have to worry about being cold or hungry again. Sometimes, she would whisper her dreams to Simba, who would purr softly in response, nuzzling against her shoulder as if promising they'd find that place one day. When night fell, Faith and Simba would find a safe, quiet corner to rest. Some nights they'd curl up under a bridge where the concrete would shelter them from the wind. Other nights, they'd nestle in a makeshift bed behind a row of bushes in the park, hidden away from prying eyes. Faith would wrap her arms around Simba, and the little kitten would snuggle against her chest, sharing his warmth as they drifted off to sleep. One evening, after a long day of searching, they managed to find a small loaf of bread left behind by a bakery. It was a little stale, But to Faith and Simba, it was a feast. They ate together, savoring each bite, feeling a sense of joy and accomplishment, as if they'd found hidden treasure. As they curled up that night, Simba nestled in Faith's arms, purring softly, and she whispered, "We did good today, didn't we, Simba? One day we'll find a place that feels like home. I know it." The kitten blinked up at her, his green eyes bright in the dim light, as if he understood every word she said. And as Faith closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep, she felt for the first time in a long while that maybe she wasn't alone after all. She had a friend, a tiny, brave soul named Simba, and together they would face whatever challenges the world threw their way. Faith sighed, hugging her knees and looking up at the stars. Though she didn't know where her journey would lead her, she whispered a wish once more, hoping that someday, just like in her dream, she might find her true family and a place to belong. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the city streets grew dim, Faith and Simba wandered into a quiet alleyway. They had walked a long way that day and were both exhausted, hoping to find a place to rest for the night. Near the end of the alley, Faith spotted a small, covered nook, shielded from the cold wind. It looked safe, and she was relieved, imagining that she and Simba could curl up there together. But as she approached, Faith suddenly heard a rough voice behind her. "Hey, kid! What do you think you're doing?" Faith turned, startled. A man with a scruffy beard and worn clothes was standing near the nook. His eyes glinted with annoyance, and he moved closer, his footsteps heavy on the ground. "This is my spot! You and that cat of yours, get out of here!" Fear surged through her. Faith took a few steps backward, pulling Simba close in her arms, and tried to stammer an apology. But before she could say anything, the man took a step forward, raising his arm to shoo her away. Panicked, Faith turned and ran, her heart pounding as she tried to put distance between them. She sprinted down the alley, not looking back, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her mind raced, fear fueling her steps. She ran so fast that she didn't see the crack in the pavement until it was too late. Her foot caught, and with a painful jolt, she tumbled forward. She hit the ground hard, scraping both knees and her palms. The sharp sting of the scrapes made her wince, tears pricking her eyes as she tried to sit up. Her knees throbbed, a thin trickle of blood running down her legs, staining her worn-out jeans. But the pain was nothing compared to the sinking feeling in her heart. In her rush to escape, she'd let go of Simba. She looked around frantically, her heart heavy with dread. "Simba?" she called out, her voice trembling. But there was only silence. The alley was empty, and Simba was nowhere in sight. A deep ache filled her chest, and panic started to rise. She had never felt so alone as she did in that moment, with the cold wind biting into her scraped knees and the night closing in around her. A wave of guilt washed over her. How could she have let him go? Simba had been her little companion, her only friend, and now he was gone. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she imagined him lost in the dark, just as scared as she was. The thought of Simba out there, without anyone to protect him, made her heart ache. Determined to find him, Faith struggled to her feet, wincing at the pain in her knees. She ignored the sting and started to retrace her steps, calling out softly, "Simba, please come back." Each step felt heavier than the last, her knees throbbing, but she pushed forward. She felt desperate, her chest tight with worry. All she could think about was finding Simba and holding him close, feeling his soft fur under her fingers. She whispered his name again, hoping he'd appear, hoping he hadn't wandered off too far. Just as despair began to set in, she heard the faintest sound, an unmistakable high-pitched meow. Her heart leapt. She froze, listening intently, hoping it wasn't just her imagination, and then she heard it again, a little louder this time, drifting from the direction she had come from. With renewed determination, Faith turned and hobbled back, her pulse racing. Rounding a corner, Faith's eyes landed on a small cardboard box tucked behind an old dumpster. There, nestled inside, was Simba, his tiny eyes wide with curiosity and fear, peeking out as if wondering if it was really her. She felt an overwhelming rush of relief as she saw him. "Oh, Simba," she whispered, dropping to her knees and ignoring the fresh sting of pain. She reached out, and the kitten immediately stumbled toward her, brushing his soft little head against her hand. His purrs were like music to her ears, and for a moment, everything felt okay again. As she cradled Simba close, Faith suddenly felt a presence behind her. She turned cautiously, her breath catching in her throat, to find an elderly woman watching her from a few paces away. The woman wore a long, faded coat and had a look of gentle wisdom in her eyes. She had graying hair tucked under a knitted cap, and she seemed almost to blend with the shadows, as though she had been waiting in the background, unnoticed, for quite some time. "Lost, are you, dear?" the woman asked softly, her voice smooth and warm. Her gaze flicked to Simba, then back to Faith, with a kindness that immediately put Faith at ease. Faith hesitated, but then nodded, clutching Simba a little tighter. "Yes," she whispered, feeling vulnerable under the woman's steady gaze. The woman nodded knowingly, her eyes softening. "Funny thing about being lost. Sometimes it leads you to exactly where you need to be," she said, giving Faith a small, mysterious smile. "Come along, child. I think I have something that may help you." Faith hesitated, glancing down at Simba, who seemed as calm as she felt. Against her usual instincts, she felt drawn to the woman's kindness, her words tugging at her heart in a way that felt almost magical. She stood up, wiping her scraped knees, and followed the woman, who led her through a series of narrow, winding alleyways Faith hadn't noticed before. The streets were strangely quiet, save for the occasional clink of the woman's worn boots on the pavement. At last, they came to a modest doorway tucked between two tall buildings, barely noticeable in the dim light. The woman opened the door, revealing a warm, cozy room bathed in the soft glow of a single lantern. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with items Faith had never seen before, glass jars filled with colorful, glittering powders, bundles of dried herbs, and strange old-fashioned tools. A fire crackled in a tiny hearth, casting a warm light that made Faith's exhaustion fade just a bit. The woman gestured for Faith to sit by the fire. "I've always had a feeling that someone special would find their way here one day," she said with a twinkle in her eye. She picked up a small pot and set it over the fire, and within minutes, the room filled with the comforting smell of warm soup. As the woman ladled a bowl for Faith and a saucer of milk for Simba, Faith felt her heart start to open, filling with a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Here, with the mysterious woman and Simba safe beside her, she felt as though she'd finally found a small corner of the world that cared for her. The warmth of the fire, the soothing flavors of the soup, and the gentle purring of Simba in her lap all wrapped around her like a comforting hug. The woman watched her with a thoughtful smile. "You see, Faith," she said quietly, "the world has a funny way of guiding us, even when it feels like we're just wandering alone." She leaned in closer, her eyes twinkling with that same mysterious kindness. "Sometimes Even the darkest roads can lead to a little bit of magic. For the first time in a long while, Faith felt a sense of peace settle over her. She glanced down at Simba, and, for a brief moment, it was as if everything in her life, the loneliness, the wandering, even her scraped knees, had all been leading her here, to this warm room, with Simba purring and a kind stranger who seemed to know exactly what she needed, as she drifted into a peaceful sleep that night. Faith couldn't help but wonder if the mysterious woman was right. Perhaps she had finally found the beginning of her journey home. When Faith opened her eyes, the room was still bathed in the soft morning light filtering through a small dusty window. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, her mind clouded by the peaceful warmth she had fallen asleep to. Simba was curled up beside her, purring softly. But as her senses sharpened, Faith felt a cold chill slip over her. The kind woman was gone. At first, Faith told herself she was probably in another room, just out of sight. She called out tentatively, her voice shaky. "Hello? Are you there?" The silence that answered felt heavy, wrapping around her like the old, familiar emptiness she thought she'd escaped. Her heart sank as the reality began to settle in. A feeling of abandonment washed over her, sharp and raw. She thought of the woman's gentle smile, her calming voice, and the kindness she had shown to both her and Simba. The warmth of that memory now felt like a trick of the night, a fragile dream that had shattered with the dawn. Questions swirled in her mind, each one louder than the last. Why did she leave? Where did she go? Was I just another lost child she happened to help, nothing more? A lump formed in Faith's throat, a weight that made her feel smaller and lonelier than ever. Her fingers clutched at Simba, who nuzzled her as if sensing her distress, and she took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's okay, Simba," she whispered, though it felt more like she was trying to convince herself. "We'll be fine. We've managed on our own before." Glancing around the cozy room, she noticed something she hadn't seen the night before, a neatly folded bundle sitting on the chair where the woman had sat. Faith's heart leapt. She crawled over and found a small loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, a bottle of water, and a note. Her hands shook as she opened it, the handwriting delicate and slanted. "Dear Faith, I had to leave before dawn. But know that you are not alone. This world is filled with challenges, but it is also full of kind souls and hidden magic if you know where to look. Trust your heart, follow its light, and remember, even the smallest souls carry strength beyond measure. May you find the family you dream of, my dear girl. Until then, take care of little Simba, and take care of yourself. With all my heart, a friend." Tears pricked Faith's eyes as she read the letter, her emotions a mix of gratitude, sadness, and a strange sense of hope. The woman hadn't left her without thought or care. She had left Faith with a gift, a blessing, and a promise that perhaps, somewhere, there was kindness waiting for her in the world. Taking a steadying breath, Faith wiped her eyes and looked down at Simba, who gazed back up at her, his little face full of trust. She felt a surge of determination, stronger than the loneliness that threatened to consume her. The woman's words seemed to settle inside her, warming her heart and planting seeds of courage. Faith slipped the bread and water into a pocket of her worn coat, and with Simba tucked carefully in her arms, she stepped out of the room and back into the winding streets. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but something inside her felt different, like she carried a piece of that hidden magic the woman had spoken of. As they walked, Faith kept her eyes open, paying attention to each street corner, each glimmer of light, and every person they passed. She was no longer just a lost child looking for shelter. She was searching for something more, a place to belong, a family, or maybe, just maybe, a hint of magic that would help her find the path home. Faith sat quietly at the bus stop, the cool metal of the bench pressing against her legs through her thin, worn pants. Simba curled in her lap, purring softly, his warmth a small comfort as she watched the people around her come and go. She'd been sitting there for a while, taking a break after walking all morning, gathering her thoughts on where to go next. The world felt a bit overwhelming, but the bread and water from the woman's bundle had revived her spirits, giving her just enough hope to keep moving forward. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over everything, when she heard the faint hum of a car engine. She glanced up absent-mindedly, not expecting anything unusual. But as the car drew closer, Faith's heart skipped a beat. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the two faces inside, faces that had haunted her dreams and memories. The adults from the place she had escaped were driving slowly down the street, their heads turning as if they were looking for something. Or someone. Faith's blood ran cold as she realized they hadn't seen her yet, but they were scanning the sidewalks, their sharp eyes flicking back and forth. In a flash of instinct, Faith ducked down behind the small wall of the bus shelter, clutching Simba close to her chest, her heart pounding wildly. She could feel her entire body go tense, as if every part of her was trying to disappear. Her mind raced. What if they see me? What if they stop? She knew that if they took her back, everything she had fought for, every brave step she had taken, would be lost. She stayed as still as she could, holding her breath, listening to the hum of the car's engine grow louder as it passed. She could feel her heart beating so loudly she feared they might hear it from inside the car. Simba wriggled slightly in her arms, sensing her tension, but she held him tighter, silently begging him to stay still. Faith dared to peek, just enough to catch a glimpse of the car as it rolled past the bus stop. She recognized the woman in the passenger seat, stern, unfeeling, her mouth set in a hard line. The man behind the wheel had his brow furrowed, his eyes darting around with a look of frustration and impatience. They hadn't seen her yet, but Faith knew they were close, too close for comfort. Just as the car was about to pass by, a group of children on bicycles zoomed past, their laughter echoing through the street. Faith shrank back further as the sound momentarily distracted the adults in the car. They glanced at the children, then each other, exchanging what looked like an annoyed sigh before the car sped up, leaving the bus stop behind. Faith stayed hidden for several moments after the car disappeared, her whole body frozen in fear. She didn't even realize she was trembling until Simba nuzzled her hand, a tiny mew escaping his throat as if to say, "It's okay." When she was finally sure the car was gone, Faith exhaled shakily, her hands loosening around Simba. Her legs felt wobbly as she straightened up, still too scared to move, but desperate to put distance between herself and the direction the car had gone. She glanced down the road, her heart aching with relief but also with a sharp pang of fear. They were still looking for her. She knew now that as long as she stayed near this area, there was a chance she would be found. With determination igniting in her chest, Faith gathered her things, cradling Simba tightly as she stepped away from the bus stop and back onto the sidewalk. Every step forward felt heavier, tinged with the knowledge that the adults she had run from weren't going to stop searching. But she would keep moving, keep hiding, and keep hoping that somewhere out there, a true, safe haven awaited her. Just as Faith was beginning to feel a little sick, she saw a car with flashing lights come down the street. It was a police car, and her heart thumped nervously, but she held Simba tightly for courage. She wondered if the bad people had police officers looking for her too. Out stepped a police officer named Ben, with a warm smile and eyes that looked kind and caring. Faith took a tiny step backward, feeling scared that the officer will take her back to the mean people. Officer Ben walked slowly towards her, careful not to startle her, and knelt down to her level. "Hi there, little one," he said in a gentle voice. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Faith avoided his gaze. Officer Ben assured Faith that he was there to help her and her kitty. Faith looked up at him with wide eyes and, in a soft whisper, said, "Can you help me find my family?" Her words hung in the air, and Officer Ben's heart melted at her bravery. With a comforting smile, Officer Ben responded, "Of course, sweetheart. Let's make sure you're safe, warm, and find your family who will love you forever." Officer Ben gently took her hand, and together they went to the police station. When they arrived at the police station, a friendly woman greeted them with a warm smile. Faith was given a warm meal, a cozy blanket, and Simba a bowl of milk. The next day, Officer Ben begins to ask Faith questions that may assist him in finding her family. Faith could not tell him anything because she didn't know. Puzzled, Officer Ben asked, "Can you tell me where you came from? Do you know your address? How long have you been on the streets by yourself?" Faith had no answers for him, except that she has been walking the streets for a few weeks now. Officer Ben asked, "Do you have a phone number of someone we can call?" Faith shook her head, "No." Officer Ben noticed the scrapes and bruises on Faith's hand and knees. "How did you get those bruises?" he asked. Faith looked at her palm and knees and told him how she fell, running away from an angry, strange man. Her small body tensed with each question Officer Ben was asking. Fully aware that if she tells the officer the truth, he will take her back, but if she doesn't say anything, he might help her. Officer Ben got up from his desk to go and talk to the friendly woman who greeted them earlier. Faith noticed while in conversation, Officer Ben and the lady continued to look back and forth at her. Then it dawned on Faith that the mean people may know those answers. If she tells him the truth, she will finally get back home with her family. With Simba coddling in her arms, she asked him, "What should we do?" Within moments, 2 officers come waltzing in with a man in cuffs. The man was yelling at the officers, telling them they were wrong. He was not resisting arrest. Faith's heart began to race, as the voice was a familiar voice she heard and hated over the years. With Simba in her arms, Faith quickly scrambled to the nearest corner to hide herself, to not be seen by the man. As the commotion continued, she saw a door where she could exit. She quickly ran for the door and made it outside into the world of the unknown. With all of the commotion that was occurring, Officer Ben became distracted, causing him to lose sight of Faith. When he noticed she was no longer at his desk, he quickly scurried from room to room and desk to desk, searching for her. He grabbed his belongings and raced outdoors. He stood there looking all around to see if he could see Faith. He saw a little body down the street dashed around the corner. He quickly ran to get in his car to follow her. As he turned the corner, he saw a few kids standing playing, he thought. But as he got closer, they were actually bullying someone. He got out of his car and went to break up the gathering. With her back against the wall, it was Faith in tears, holding on tightly to Simba. He yelled to the kids to go home, or I can take you home. Seeing the nervous look on her face, Officer Ben knelt down slowly, a warm smile on his face. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly. "I'm here for you to keep you safe." "Why did you run from the station?" he asked. Without looking the officer in his eyes, Faith lied and said she got scared because that man was yelling. Officer Ben laughed and said, "They are always yelling when they are caught for doing something wrong." Faith asked, "What did he do?" Officer Ben said, "Got caught speeding and tried to resist arrest. Remember, we're here to make sure you're safe." His gentle tone and kind eyes helped her feel a little braver. so she took a small step closer. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. "We'll get you something warm to eat and find a cozy place for you to rest." Faith looked at him and asked, "Are we going back to the station?" Officer Ben said, "Yes." Faith pulled back and said she did not want to go back there. The officer asked, "Where can we go? You don't know where you live. You have no one to call, and you have to think about Simba. He can't survive without you." Faith looked at Simba as he purred softly. She hesitated, glancing down at her Simba, still unsure. The kindness in Officer Ben's eyes made her feel like she could trust him. With a small nod, she reached out, her hand tiny in his, and together they began walking toward his car. As they walked, Officer assured Faith that he will keep her safe. It was these words that made Faith come clean and tell Officer Ben everything. A half an hour later, she saw Officer Ben talking into his radio. She didn't understand all the words, but she heard him say something about needing backup. A wave of worry washed over her. Did that mean more people were coming? Would they be kind or scary? Officer Ben asked Faith to remain in the car. As he exited the vehicle heading into the police station, he took one last look at Faith and gave her the thumbs up. Within a few minutes, Officer Ben returned. He asked Faith to trust him. He will need her to stay at the station with Grace until he returns. Faith nodded. No. Officer Ben said, "Don't worry about the man, Thomas. He is locked in a cell where he can't hear or see you." Faith, you're very brave for sharing this. You've helped us understand just how serious this situation is. Thomas and his friends, they may have been involved in things we didn't realize before. He leaned down, meeting her eye level again. "I'm going to make sure no one hurts you or anyone else. We're going to bring them all in, and I'm going to need your help. Are you up for that?" Faith nodded, a wave of relief mingling with nerves. She felt as though, for the first time, someone was truly listening. Ben turned to the other officers, issuing instructions. "We need backup teams to spread out in the area around Faith's description," he said firmly, "and keep a close watch on anyone who's been associated with Thomas. If they're connected to the operation she described, we'll bring them all in for questioning." Over the next hour, Faith watched with a mixture of fear and amazement as officers sprang into action, radios crackling with calls and descriptions. Ben remained close by, updating her on every new lead they followed. "We're close," Ben said quietly as he guided her back to a safe area where they could wait together. "I know this is scary, but you've done an incredible job helping us find out the truth. With the information you shared, we'll be able to help those other kids too." Faith's heart swelled with a mix of hope and gratitude. She clutched Simba tightly, her fears fading in the presence of Officer Ben's determination. Finally, Ben's radio buzzed with a voice she didn't recognize. "Targets apprehended. All suspects en route back to the station. Over." Ben turned to Faith with a smile that was both comforting and proud. "It's over, Faith. We got them. And you're safe now." In that moment, Faith felt the weight of her long journey finally lifting. She was safe, truly safe, for the first time in as long as she could remember. Just then, another officer stepped into the quiet of the lobby and made his way over to Ben. His face was drawn and serious, his voice barely a whisper as he leaned in close. "Ben," he began, casting a quick glance toward Faith. "We've done everything we could to locate Faith's family." He paused, letting out a weary sigh. "The other children, they were all taken from their homes. We've located every family, but for Faith, there's been no sign of any relatives. She seems to have no one." Ben's heart tightened as the officer's words settled over him. No one. The idea of telling Faith felt impossible, knowing how desperately she'd clung to the hope of finding family. He glanced at her, still curled up with Simba, looking so small and fragile under the station's dim lights. She had already endured so much, and he couldn't bear to see her world crumble again. Ben took a steadying breath and nodded slowly to the officer, forcing himself to stay composed. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But inside, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts and a quiet desperation he hadn't felt in years. As the dust settled around the station, Officer Ben found himself pacing quietly in the corner, lost in his thoughts. The relief of seeing Thomas and the others apprehended was immense, but a different feeling gripped his heart, a deep, unshakable sadness. Over the last few days, Faith had opened up to him, her guarded heart slowly letting him in. She had become like family to him, a child who filled a part of his life he hadn't even known was empty. Faith was sitting just a few feet away, curled up on a chair, with Simba in her lap, her eyes beginning to close from exhaustion. Every so often, she'd glance up at him, as if for reassurance that everything was still okay, that he was still there, keeping her safe. Ben wanted to smile back and reassure her, but his heart weighed heavy with a truth he was struggling to carry. Just as he was turning back toward Faith, she looked up, blinking sleepily, but sensing something was wrong. "Officer Ben?" she murmured, her voice small. Just as he was turning back toward Faith, she looked up, blinking sleepily, but sensing something was wrong. "Officer Ben?" she murmured, her voice small, as if afraid of the answer. Did they find my family too?" Ben's stomach dropped, and he had to look away, his thoughts scrambling to find a way to protect her from this truth. But before he could respond, the station doors swung open, and a figure stepped inside. The sudden movement drew everyone's attention, including Faith. Faith sat up, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and hope. Officer Ben watched her, feeling his heart pound in his chest. Could this be it? Could this woman somehow be connected to Faith? Ben caught himself holding his breath as the woman knelt down, bringing herself to face level. Her voice was gentle, trembling with emotion. "Faith," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "My name is Maria. I think I might have known your family." Faith's eyes widened, her heart pounding so hard she could hardly breathe. Her gaze flickered to Ben, searching his face for reassurance, then back to Maria. As Maria reached out a hand, a deep silence filled the room, thick with anticipation and the possibility that Faith's story had more left to reveal. The answers to who she was, who she belonged to, seemed within reach. Hearing this, Officer Ben walked over to greet Maria. "Glad you came. Since we have to follow proper protocol, we cannot release Faith to you. Immediately family only." Maria nodded. Officer Ben kneeled down to Faith and shared, "She will be resting at him tonight." Faith excitedly hugged the officer. After arriving to his home, Faith's eyes grew big. With excitement, she turned and asked, "You live here?" Officer Ben responded yes, and asked her, "Why?" Faith shared that the woman who lives here was the first person to take care of her, and she stayed here for one night. Ben scratched his head and said, "Faith, you may have visited another unit here." Faith looked at a picture on the wall. She pointed to his mother and said, "I came home with her." For a brief moment, Ben could not wrap his head around this conversation. He asked Faith, "Can you prove you were here?" Faith thought about the note that was left behind. Somehow Faith managed to remember the woman quotes, "Funny thing about being lost. Sometimes it leads you to exactly where you need to be." As Ben heard this, he slowly stumbled to his chair. With his hands over his face, he tried hard to mask the tears. Faith concluded with, "You see, Faith," she said quietly, "the world has a funny way of guiding us, even when it feels like we're just wandering alone." Ben could not bear it any more. He got up from his chair and slowly walked to Faith. Faith, not sure what was happening, with Simba in tow, began to move backwards. Officer Ben assured Faith that he was in awe of the words she spoke. Only he and his mom spoke this. Puzzled, Faith was not sure what that meant, until Officer Ben revealed, "My mom has not lived here in over 15 years. She passed, leaving me this home." Startled and confused, Faith had some questions that she know may not be answered at this moment. Stay tuned for part 2.